Hello, and welcome to Common Threads Between Game Writers and Designers. My name is Eddie Louise, and I'll be your moderator today. And I am joined by a host of people that are all smarter than me. So I'm going to call them one by one and let them introduce themselves, tell you about their own work in games and what they're obsessing about right now, and then we'll get started. So I'm just going by the order of the videos in my stream. So to my immediate left is Whitney Stixx Beltran. Whitney, will you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everybody. My name is Whitney Stixx Beltran. If you can, you got to roll the R. I go by Stixx in the video game world. I am a project narrative director at Hidden Path Entertainment. I have made such games as Bluebeard's Bride, Raccoon Lagoon. I wrote for State of Decay 2, was the lead on Beyond Blue, Hollow Vista, which is about to come out and very exciting. And then, of course, my full-time project, which is a big thing that I'm not allowed to talk about for many years because that's how it goes. I am also a gaming academic. I have a master's degree in mythology and psychology, which I apply to narrative design. And I'm a diversity and inclusion advocate in gaming spaces. So that's me.
Thank you, Stixx. Jeremy Holcomb.
Hello, yeah, my name's Jeremy Holcomb. I'm coming at this from the game design side. My background is as an analog designer. I design collectible card games like Anachronism for the History Channel, board games like The Duke. I did the White Box, which is a game design toolkit to help other people make games of their own. I have a master's in behavioral economics and teach game design at DigiPen Institute of Technology, again, to help more people make games so that we can play cool stuff.
Thank you. And Evie Powell.
Hello, I'm Evie Powell. I am a game designer / creative director. I run an independent game studio in Seattle called Verge of Brilliance, where we specialize in virtual reality, augmented reality experiences. Made games like Epic Snow Day Adventure and Melody. And then when I'm not doing that, I work on using virtual reality and augmented reality technology for surgeons in actual intraoperative surgery. Yeah. So yeah, I also come from a very heavily academic background. I have a PhD where I did my dissertation on socially pervasive game experiences. So I like to think about things about like the next generation of games, what are those going to look and feel like.
Fantastic. And Phoebe Burton.
Hi, I'm Phoebe Burton. I'm a trans queer writer. I'm just starting out on my game development path. I'm currently in edits for the interactive fiction The Luminous Underground with Choice of Games, which will be coming out sometime later this year. And so I am still very new to the game side of it. I come to it from science fiction writing, and starting with interactive fiction has been very enlightening, and it's made me want to really focus on doing a lot more in the game space in the future.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least is Chris Miller of Silver Spook Games.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Silver Spook Miller, and I am well, I've been working on games for a long time, but my most recent project is Silver Spook Games. I'm basically the writer, programmer, artist, musician, and I do half of the voice acting for a game called Neofeud, which is a independently created, obviously, cyberpunk adventure game. And it's a game that, you know, it's kind of a retro 90s LucasArts, Monkey Island, Sierra sort of game, but with but it's my personal experiences as a native. I'm also a Native Hawaiian activist, and I'm a former social worker and STEM teacher on the not so nice side of the tropical Disneyland that is Hawaii. And so it's about that. It's about empire, capitalism, white supremacy, all the best things, and my less than nice takes on those things. And so those sound interesting if you like. And also my biggest claim to fame is I'm a friend of William Gibson, and my interview with William Gibson is like on my YouTube channel because He's a cool person, but I think he pulls too many punches, so I punch for him. Anyway, but yeah, I work at AAA games, smaller game companies, mid-sized game companies, and I started my own company because I couldn't publish what I actually wanted to say about the world, except independently. So that's me.
Fantastic. And I'm Eddie Louise. I am a novelist and an audio drama creator, as well as an avid game player. And thank you all for joining me today. For our audience, there is a reminder, if you're not seeing the chat in Discord, we're in the Scioto Even channel, and you may need to refresh if you were in another panel before this in a different room. So you may need to refresh in order to get this room so that you can add any comments or questions you like during the panel will be transmitted to me, and we can ask our panelists and have you interact. So I want to just jump right in. The title of this is Common Threads for Game Writers and Designers. And as far as I'm concerned, unless you have background noise where you are, unmute yourself and let's just have a free-form conversation. What are the common threads between narrative and design in game writing?
Well, Eddie.
Let's start off with a big one.
I think we probably need to start out at a definitional place here. Narrative design and writing as a discipline within games is new. Within like the last 10 years or so, historically games didn't have writers or narrative designers. They were just people who were coding and designing, and they're like, oh yeah, we need to shove that thing in. That's changed a lot, and for the better. It's progressed our art form tremendously, but we are still kind of on the raggedy edge of technology and art and learning all the time. Like there are no real experts, just people who have gotten lucky doing it right the first time. You know what I mean? And going, oh yeah, that does work. That's kind of where we are as a field. So narrative design, in my personal opinion, is a designer who is shaping the game to integrate gameplay loops, so actual pushing the button, and the meaning that you get out of pushing that button. What does it mean? Does it tell me a story? And that can mean like, what is the consequence of shooting something? Does it die or does it cry? Like that is a narrative piece of game design. Whereas a game writer is someone who writes the lines, writes the dialogue, writes the lore, and there is not a defining line between the two, really. In some studios, a writer is called a narrative designer. In some studios, a narrative designer only codes. It is a wide open field. So it is really messy to try to describe what this is in the first place.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would add that looking for overlap, looking for places where there is some consistency, regardless of what we're producing, right? Whether it's more of a writer words content, whether it's more of a narrative design, sort of emotional design standpoint, the biggest overlap is that I love you all. We don't matter. The player matters, right? And that focus of not like, oh, I am writing this. I don't know. I know plenty of writers, my early self included, who are just like, I am writing this because I want to write this for me. That's cool, right? There's nothing wrong with that. We all start somewhere. But at some point you have to turn around and go, wait a minute, what do these words actually do for the person reading them? And then when we're looking at narrative, in the same way that Stixx was talking about, what is the player actually going to do and engage with this standpoint? So getting away from, is this writing good, as if the good was in the box, as if the good was in the code, and getting back to, hang on, how does the player, how does the user, how does the reader, how does the person we're actually creating an experience for experience this? And that's consistent, that headspace is very similar in my mind.
Yeah, I guess for me, just thinking about that, because I'm coming from a far less experienced viewpoint, but for me, what I've especially been focusing toward is just the idea of the writing coming to a point, having that awareness of what the point behind everything you're writing is aiming towards in the game, because yeah, it's a game, it's for the player. That doesn't still mean that you can't use it to get a point across, to argue for something through the nature of what choices are given to the player, what options they have to overcome whatever situation is placed in front of them. Something that I've had to deal with a lot in interactive fiction, because I'm always having to come up with at least 3 mechanisms for a player to get past a specific challenge. And it's just more in it. I feel like it enables something that's more richer, because a lot of the problems that I encounter, where I feel like the narrative design may not be that as rooted to the game as it could be, is when the game is built to such an extent where it's impossible to interact with the world of the game, or essentially impossible to interact with the world of the game outside of a weapon.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, I don't have too much to add to this, but yeah, I would imagine that narrative design really comes into play in some of the games that we're seeing today, where you are, you know, you're playing as someone that has a character that's a little more in depth than they have been in the past. Like, these aren't, you know, James Bond-esque characters anymore. They may have come from a non sort of, you know, they may not have just been a spy their whole life. Maybe you're seeing a progression of the starting point is, you know, they were just a student or a traveler or something like that, and they're progressing and turning into a warrior or turning into the savior of the world or something like that. And when you're playing a game like that, then the game mechanics need to reflect that growth and that progression. So it doesn't really match if you're playing a character that has just seen someone die for the first time, and then that follows up with a fit of rage, and then they shoot like headshot like 5 different people all at the same time, and you're just like, well, where did that come from? And that doesn't really fit, and it doesn't fit with the tone and all of that stuff. So I think one of the things that creators need to do is figure out how these mechanics, how these progressions, and how growth actually affects how the story is being told, and whether these actually match up.
That brings us to the wonderful word of ludonarrative dissonance.
I was going to bring that up in mine, but I wasn't sure if I should break it out this early.
So my personal opinion is that all games have narrative design elements, and you can either ignore them or you can engage with them, but they're there. Tetris tells a story. It does. And so you don't even need to have people in your game to have narrative design be present as a subdiscipline or a discipline. And for the folks in the audience who have maybe not heard this word before, ludonarrative harmony or dissonance is the idea that there is an issue between ludo, play, and narrative, story, that is causing friction, meaning the actions that you are taking are not lining up with the things that you should be experiencing narratively or emotionally, and this causes dissonance. Now, it's not a universally bad word. Like, you can create games specifically to engage with ludonarrative dissonance because you're doing something specific to prove a point or make people feel things. But in general practice, as a narrative designer, you want to make sure that there is as much harmony as possible between gameplay mechanics and the message and the story and the feeling and all the stuff that the game is trying to express and to wrap the player into. You know, good game design is marrying narrative and mechanics together holistically. In our industry, there's this phrase that we hear a lot called gameplay is king. I don't think gameplay is king. I think that they are equals. And someday we will get to that point of narrative equality. But in my studio, at least, that is how we do things, is a very, very tightly integrated marriage of narrative and pure design, if there is such a thing as pure design.
That's fantastic. Now, I'd like to start off the next. question with Chris, actually, because something you said in your introduction really struck me. We're just putting it out there. It's not hidden. I am a middle-aged white woman. So I have lived in the dominant narrative my entire life. And much of my dominant narrative is teaching me that my way is normal. And a big part of my own unlearning process has been learning how to appreciate other cultures and other perspectives. And fiction, and especially gameplay fiction, I'm noticing is really beginning to be a partner in that. So what I'm wondering is, in what ways are games now really stretching the way we perceive narrative and really helping us break that dominant paradigm?
Yeah, I mean, like games definitely play a major role. Like any any medium, any educational, any means of distribution of information, culture, norms, whether that's textbooks, film, print media, social media, but games in particular can play a strong role in altering what the dominant narrative. I'm trying to do this. I go on long 6-hour rants. I'm going to try to keep this under 2 minutes, but basically, yeah, what you're saying is definitely an important aspect. I'm actually part of a Indigenous game developers groups, and that's part of the discussions we often have. Is like, how do we tell Anishinaabe stories, Wet'suwet'en stories, Cherokee stories, like they're actual stories, not like I had a little bit of 1/64 maybe, and I'm going to use that when it's convenient for me. Like, what's the actual story from my people? And so for my personal experiences, like I said before, I had the biggest creative decision I ever had at the game companies that I worked at previously was should we, in the Texas Hold'em poker for the Windows accessories, should we put the suicide jackknife on the left or the right side of the head? And it's like, how about telling a story that actually about decolonization? No, what are you talking about? We're making a card game here. We're making Flappy Bird clone number 76. Shut up and get back to work. And I'm like, I want to tell a story about my life growing up in the ghetto where everybody ate Spam for dinner and we lived 22 house and we're all dying in a food desert, and the police are killing us 6 times more per capita more than the white people. Can we talk about that? No, absolutely not. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about that. So games are an amazing place because they're things that it's hard to get film and it's hard to get TV and those sorts of mediums. They take a lot more investment, animation even, and not that games don't take a lot of investment, but the capacity for people to live in the shoes of an Indigenous person, a person of color, an Indigenous person of color in a ghetto with billionaires living up the hill from them, right down the street from where former President Obama went to school, and I can't afford to. The school that I went to a school that it costs $20,000 a year now, and I could only afford to go there because my dad taught there at the time. And I could tell this story now that I was constantly every left and right I was denied the capacity to tell this story in so many other venues, but at least. With games, you can also get the firsthand experience of making difficult decisions. Like, am I going to eat tonight, or are we going to pay the medical bills? Are we going to, am I going to erase my Hawaiianness today and just be like, you know what? I'm happy to sell a luxury condo for $2 million to a Saudi F-35 purchaser. That's totally chill. That's really great. And I'm not going to be Hawaiian today. I'm going to give up. And that's a hard, where is the Ludo narrative? Where is the, how can we make those really structured? Not should I headshot this dude or should have been the leg? But should I destroy and forget my language and who I am as a person? And what is that experience actually like? So anyway, I'm gonna try to cut it off there. But those things are things that you can really have a simulated. Well, I mean, as good as you can get, you can have a little bit of the feeling of agency. Like, for just last example, in Near Future, there's a scene in which involves police murder and police violence of marginalized people with no recourse. And there's a scene in which you are complicit in that, or you get to choose. Are you going to defend your family, or are you going to let another family lose their child and possibly one of their husband by forging basically a CPS investigation and being complicit with the police? And if you don't, you could lose your job as a cop.
That's a really good point, Chris. And Jeremy has a response.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking now.
Well, I hope you never stop talking, but the continuation of I agree that we've said games, and in the context of what we're talking about, we largely mean video games. But it is a broader pool than that, right? I think that the video game industry is pivoting into being able to do this. I don't even want to say better. I want to say less bad. But tabletop role-playing games, I think, are moving a little bit faster, partially just because it's easier to iterate them in a faster and less expensive manner. And so a lot of the old tropes from the 70s and 80s are like the audience is starting to grab on and go, no, those are not the stories that we want to tell anymore. I am not, every once in a while I want to slay a dragon, I guess, but that's kind of not the point anymore. And can we move away from alignment structures and racial tropes and all of these other things? And that is I was going to say forcing, let's say, creating a space where large chunks of the player community who many of whom look like me and who would not have otherwise had these conversations are at least being made aware, oh, wait a minute, hang on, there's something going on over there that I wasn't paying attention to before. And some people engage with it and some people don't, and that's what it is. But more people being in that conversation and being aware that these are problems at all is enormously valuable. And I hope that we can translate that into analog games, card games. You see this with, even little decisions like what Alderac Entertainment Group did with the card game Love Letter, which is a simple card game that sold a bajillion copies. There's 16 cards. There's I think 9 characters displayed, but they actually made a very deliberate decision to have with only 9 pieces of art. They have a pretty decent, like, old people exist and they're there in the game space and they're represented. Women exist, non-white people exist, and they made and they didn't have to do that, but they made a decision to do that. And the more that we're making those decisions in those little moments where it's not a huge thing, it's not $7 billion, it's I have 9 pieces of art, what do I do with them? Let's get more able to have that conversation.
Yeah, in Love Letter, they even managed to do the woman as disposable, because if the king or the prince shows up when you have the countess, you have to dispose of her because, she's the less valuable, as it were. So it's fantastic. Yeah, and that's a great way, that narrative. Does anyone else have any examples or things they'd like to talk about the way that games are stretching the way we perceive narrative in our world today?
I know I just recently finished the game The Last of Us Part 2. The game is brilliant and frustrating and every other emotion in between. I really wish I could talk about it more without spoiling it. But ultimately, one of the things that really comes to mind is how they're pushing the idea of using the idea of agency and giving it to you and taking it away from you, more importantly, to tell a story. Because, as we get better at things and creating all of these really interesting sort of dialogue trees and different directions and ways people can tell a story and take it a different direction based off of what kind of player they are, we started to really value that, like the ability to, I choose my destiny. They've given me a crossroads. I can choose to go left or I can choose to go right. But a really interesting way of telling stories is taking that agency, taking that ability to make a decision for yourself away from the player, because you're a part of the system, or you are to bear witness to something that is about to happen. And for a lot of people, including myself, that is that's sort of painful, going through getting into these characters and knowing that you have to make them make a terrible decision, and that you have a choice, which is basically either push the button, potentially kill a player or kill a person in the game, or do something, or put the game down. That's your decision now, because you don't have agency. You don't get to do that. And they've taken it away at just the right time. And so for me, I think that's a really interesting way that I've seen a couple of different games recently get their point across and their meaning across by sort of playing push and pull with these different types of levers of when do I make something make you feel extremely present, And then where do I actually make you feel like you actually are making decisions? And then where do I make you feel like you're embodied and that you have, you know, you're actually picking up something and doing something. And then the push and pull of those types of things can tell really interesting stories, rather than just sort of going the direction of, you know, all agency, all decisions are mine. You know, I get to choose the destiny of the player or whatever. That's a really good, interesting story, but, you know, there are other ways to tell a story too.
Yeah,
So,
I agree with you, Evie. I think the way that the industry has treated agency up to this point has been actually really under sophisticated. And they've kind of used it as a blunt object and a carte blanche. And carte blanche is not the only way to treat agency. Agency is a game of cat and mouse that the designer is playing with the player. And as we get more sophisticated in playing those games, I think that helps us open up to new genres and avenues of different types of games we haven't played before. My tabletop RPG, Bluebeard's Bride, is actually notoriously well known for taking away agency in ways that people find enjoyable. And it was hard to do. Like, it took over a year and a half of playtesting once it was done to hone that in, because we're all kind of like learning how to do it in the subtle ways for the first time. But I think, you know, as our ability to craft these interactive stories continues to grow, we'll get those more sophisticated narratives that play with our agency in ways that we enjoy.
That's fantastic. I would like to remind our audience that you can type up questions in the Discord chat, and they will come through to us here so we can bring those into the panelists. As a follow-up to that last question, I'd like to ask you, panelists, do you feel it's important for game writers and designers to consider the post-game narrative construction of the players? Evie just gave us a fabulous post-game narrative construction of her experience with The Last of Us 2, but how much does that play into your overall thinking when you're constructing a game?
For me, it's something I've had to think about from the beginning, because part of the structure that goes into a choice of games game, because they are very heavily based on changing stats, which is one of the things that happens in the background between the player making all these choices. And part of the possibilities is that these games can fractalize once you get to the end, because the fundamental interactive fiction does differ from a lot of other games that you might name. Like I haven't played The Last of Us 2, for example, but games like that are generally like open world games do have a very different structure in that there are a lot of things that a player could do at any given point rather than being taken through the story step by step, whereas in interactive fiction, it is a lot more on rails of a process. And at the end is really the only point where you can safely fractalize, because otherwise if that's something that begins early on and the player is given massive opportunities for massively diverging choices early on, it is something that can make a game completely too unwieldy to actually put together. So the post game is where all of these things that the player has been building towards through the course of the game can be realized. And I mean, like coming from my, like, I've been involved in playing the Fallout games since the 90s. And one of the things I liked about that the most was that after you beat the game, after you went through the final confrontation, they would do the slides telling you what happened to all of these places that you went through in the game, depending on what you had done there. And so it is the post game thing really does further connect the player to the world by saying, yes, like you made an effect on the world. The things you did made a difference. And I think that's it's a very important and very powerful thing. And that's something that a lot of people look to games for, to be able to not just do these things and make these choices that they might not be able to do in reality, but also be able to see the consequences of what they have done.
So we have a comment from the audience, from Matt Arnold, that Ramses is a great example of interactive fiction that masterfully uses the lack of agency to help convey this story. Yeah, and I would agree. I've played that one. And it's interesting to me because a lot of the talk in fiction is about the agency and how we treat characters, and the whole concept of the refrigerator wife and all of those things that I know gaming has struggled with as well. And yet, as an author, I take great delight in denying the agency of my characters and in forcing them into situations that if they could have wormed their way out of, they would. And so I narrow down their choices until they go where I want. And so it's really interesting for me, that conflict when it comes to gameplay. And I'm wondering, so Knitting Binary says, how do you feel lore made outside of gameplay influences the game and the players?
I would need to know more about that question. Like, is it part of the materials the game company is putting forward? Is it fan fiction? Was it intended to do that?
The first thing that came to my mind is, how much is the lore of Star Wars affected, the newest Jedi game? And how much did that, because that's a very vocal fandom, and there's years of lore.
I feel like that lore has paralyzed the franchise in a not good way. We care a lot about Star Wars, but there are things going on within the community that aren't healthy. And we're trying to hold a property hostage by this perfect nostalgic view of it in the past that never actually existed, and then getting really angry when it doesn't meet those expectations, or it chooses to grow as a story medium or go in different directions. So that particular example, I'm sad about that, and I don't think it's good.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a, we're talking about capital G games in a vague sense, but there's huge differences between different media depending on what we're talking about, right? Like a video game, by its nature, has some structure, right? Like, you can't make that decision because we did not code that decision. It is not available to you, and we can constrain the space in a stronger way. Again, in a tabletop role-playing game, or actually I have a background in live-action role-playing games because I'm that particular type of nerd. And that's a space, again, where the players can just grab the wheel and go off in a totally different direction. So if they have some expectation because of the lore and the world, or if they're coming into it with different implied rules, with different backgrounds and experiences, then they'll have different content. And that's, it's not even good or bad. It's just, that's how the media works.
Sophia came with, speaking of post-game experience, I have an 11-year-old who became obsessed with Undertale a few years ago and held up for quite a few years with the whole issue of whether to play neutral, pacifist, or genocide mode and what that meant. And it was a huge deal for this person, and apparently also in the fandom. And was it different for adults? And Knitting Binary came back with, her specific thing was, what about the lore made by the company after the game comes out? How does that then influence the game and the players?
I think that's a great tool to leverage more interaction and depth with the game story. That's cool.
Yeah, I feel in terms of that lore, I feel that whole lore question, I feel like one tool that is useful for game writers in general, is to have some kind of guardrails, because if the universe you're working in has specific ways of working, it can narrow the focus enough for you to come up with things that you might not have been able to do otherwise. Because otherwise, if everything is open, there is the possibility of option dazzlement and just throwing things in maybe like throwing things in because they're cool, but not as much considering about how they might work together. Because I think a lot of issues that I've seen, like especially in terms of where ludonarrative dissonance comes up, it's when two things that were considered in isolation that were not considered in terms of working together are suddenly made to work together. And that's when major contradictions come, or not necessarily contradictions, but smoke and grinding gears can come up.
Well, and we're talking about like the decisions made by companies afterwards and driving the story and that sort of thing. I think an interesting example of the company and the audience and the players sort of working together to describe the narrative. The Legend of the Five Rings collectible card game for years did this structure where the storytellers and writers would basically build this world and build big epic conflicts and big moments, and here's these big battles or these big court things in which some big decision will be made. And then they held a tournament of the card game and the players played the game. And part of the prize was getting to influence that story, right? Like if you win with this faction, well, then that faction will win the battle in the story and will roll forward from there. So the storytellers are writing content where they're basically it's not up to the players, but it's reduced to, here are the interesting decisions. You may only make the interesting decisions, but you get to make those and feel like you're influencing the experience. And that had just not been done before. There are very few examples of that in the analog space.
That's also how we got the whole Rattlings thing, though. Right. I remember.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just giving you guys a heads up. We're about 10 minutes out. So go ahead, Evie.
Okay. Yeah, I was just saying, I come at this question from a completely sort of different perspective of one of my focuses is on pervasive experiences and socially pervasive experiences in general. And so when I think about things like lore and artifacts that are the result of a game or what has come out post-game or something like that, typically I'm usually thinking of how can I create a game that never ends? Now that's usually the antithesis mostly of what people think of as a game, because games have, they're spatially confined to a location, they're temporally confined to a span of time, and socially confined to the group of people that are playing the game. So if you're talking about a game that breaks any of those boundaries, what you're talking about is not necessarily lore or something that is sort of designed to bring you back into that experience or back into that world, but you're also sort of thinking about culture, or you're thinking about how can you create artifacts that make it so that having been a part of that experience is socially acceptable. How do you bring other people into that experience as a result of having artifacts that are worth looking at for the non-player and the player alike?
I like that.
Yeah. And so when I think about it, is that things that sort of are artifacts that are left behind from a game, and this is true in traditional games as well. You'll notice that people that play a lot of the same types of games and have a lot of those same types of shared experiences, that's ultimately what it comes down to, is they have those shared experiences. That means they're growing and learning the same way and ultimately adopting the same culture. And so, when I think about what lore does for something outside of gameplay, is that it shapes the culture, it shapes the beauty and the art around the experience, instead of just doing something that affects how you perceive the internals of the game.
That's somewhat a cautionary tale for Star Wars, because that's something they didn't shape the lore specifically, and it grew into this monster. So we have just under 10 minutes left. So I'm going to ask my magic wand question. I have a magic wand. I'm going to give you all the money, all the resources, everything in the world. What are you going to design for me? Each one of you can take about a minute to give me your ultimate. If money and time and resources are absolutely no barrier, I'm Jeff Bezos and I'm giving you my billions. What game would you want to give me?
Well, I'll start, since it sort of ties into what I was talking about, the pervasive stuff. I mean, ultimately, my desire is to create an RPG that you never leave, and it's completely acceptable to do so. When I think about games like that, I imagine that the end game looks a lot like a sort of continuum between augmented and virtual reality, depending on whether you're trying to use context of when you're very lowly engaged with the system. So if you're very minutely thinking about the game, then maybe like the steps that you're making or the direction you're going or a decision that you're making or what the weather is having an effect on your body, maybe that is tying into something that's happening in this sort of game world. Whereas if you are highly engaged, then that might be a moment where your world fades out and now you're in this other world and other experience. And so people say, if you're wearing a headset that is small enough and see-through enough that you can sort of shift seamlessly between these types of experiences, then you never necessarily have to completely leave.
Wow. Okay, who's next? Oh,
Chris,
no.
go. Chris, go.
Okay. $1 billion. I'll take all the surveillance capitalist entities, Twitter, Facebook, all of them, and regame them into like a non-capitalist version of them, like giant mastodon version of all of them, and then stop everybody from being propagandized into endless war. Anyways, but yeah, no, I think probably I'd start 10,000 indie game companies and let people tell whatever stories they wanted to tell, and like not have them be subservient to all of Jim Sterling's most hated people. That's it.
Nice.
Yeah, I would take the money and build a game to teach the concept of opportunity cost and help people understand the different opportunity costs decisions that are being made by people at different socioeconomic levels. And I would find some way to make what I just said fun. And I don't know what that is, but that's what I would want to do.
But you have all the time and resources and money in the
Sure,
world.
yeah,
so
yeah.
You
There's got to be a way. There's got to be a way.
Phoebe or Stixx, do you guys have anything to add? What would be your ultimate?
So I have to be very careful about the words that are coming out of my mouth, because
you're
if I
currently doing
described the thing that I want to make, I'm breaking NDA on the thing that I am making right now. I'm on the project of a lifetime. Like, this is the most exciting project I've ever had and will probably ever have, unless there's like a sequel. And I cannot say a goddamn word about it for the next couple of years, and it's killing me.
But that alone gives me hope.
Yeah, you're allowed to opt out of the question.
Yeah.
But I will say, when I'm old and retired, the plan is actually to move to Bangalore and start an indie studio there and make narrative-focused games for the Southeast Asian audience.
Fantastic. And Phoebe, you have all the money, all the resources in the world.
For me, it's like I'm still so new to this. I'm still figuring out what I want. So a lot of it is more like I would just write some nice, comfortable visual novels, but that's sort of what I want to do anyway.
Fantastic.
And I don't really need $1 billion to do that.
So we're in our final couple of minutes. If anyone would like to leave our audience with final thoughts, and then we can pop over into the Discord to answer questions for a few minutes after the panel closes. So let's just round robin if you have final thoughts for our audience on narrative game and common threads for writing and designing.
Yeah, I hope that this becomes an ongoing conversation. You can find me at I Was Paid to Say on Twitter, and we're all easily cyberstalked.
Yes, that's true. I'm going to plug. So I have a game launching in September that is amazing. It's called Hala Vista, and we are running an ARG ahead of the game release. I'm linking the rabbit hole in Discord, and it's up to you if you want to jump in that rabbit hole. But it's a fun mobile or iOS game that is going to have you feeling things, because that's what I do. I design things to make you have feelings. And I hope that you go on that journey with us in September.
Fantastic. Last thoughts, Evie?
Me? And I really enjoy these kinds of conversations. Happy to answer any questions. Yeah, this is kind of like, you asked the $1 million question, but I'm actually 100% planning on doing this. So it's fun to sort of think about it, and what, 10 or 20 years down the road, how we'll think of games is going to change significantly. So.
Fantastic. And I've got just a couple minutes more. So a minute for Phoebe and a minute for Chris, and we'll wind it up. Go ahead, Phoebe.
All right, so I think the conversations like this, like as has been said, yeah, like really important to keep going on, especially to bring new people and new voices into it, because being here and feeling like an actual game designer is really, really important and valuable. And it's something that can get a lot across to an audience in totally different ways from a lot of other media. And it's just so important for us to keep digging, keep building this tower and see where it goes.
Fantastic. And Chris?
Yeah, so again, I just think my my Twitter, that you can find all of my games. I basically have one game currently out under Silver Spoon Games. It's a cyberpunk adventure game that's about social, economic, and political inequality, specifically police murder, police mass incarceration. I wrote this game in 2010, though, and it's in the prison industrial, military industrial, and police industrial complexes, and the interlocking mechanisms of oppression, and my personal experiences as a native hawaiian from a ghetto, going to a private school, being the poorest, brownest kid at that school, and having all those experiences. And then also, I'm a native hawaiian activist here on Mauna Kea, defending the desecration of, or trying to stop the desecration of our sacred mountain in the middle of military exercises at RIMPAC. So anyway, you can follow all that stuff on my Twitter. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. And I hope everyone will join us over in Discord. And if not, hook up with us on social media. And thank you so much for coming to Common Threads in Game Narrative and Design. And thank you, panelists. You guys are all amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right.
Save your chat logs if you want.
Yes.
Thank you all. Excellent panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys really were amazing. So if you want to save the chat, you just pull over and chat.